All right, let's talk about communication in sports science. Really, what we're going to cover now is how do we bridge the gap between the knowledge that sports scientists generate through data collection, analysis, what have you, in practice of helping athletes. And communication is all different forms when we use this phrase. From it could be verbal, listening is part of communication, written reports, and even communication tools like email, text messaging, social media, whatever it is. There's all different forms of communication from delivering and receiving information. We're going to go over some of those key points. So, why communication matters in sports scientists? Well, effective communication connects research with practice. What we do as sports scientists, from the data collection to the data analysis, the way that we instruct athletes or subjects to perform certain tasks, we need to take all that information and translate it to practice. I can tell you a story of when I created a marathon sports science series for the community. This is back early when I started here at UNLV. And I got done with a presentation, which was to the lay audience, from a bunch of runners. And I delivered the most fantastic message about ground reaction forces, accelerations of of the leg segment, the head segment, shock attenuation. I talked about the research that I was doing and others were doing on running as it relates to marathon running, shoe research, what have you. It was not effective at all. Unfortunately, I was too tied into the science part, and I wasn't able to translate the science to runners to help them run faster or further or whatever it is, help them to train without injury. And so, really, I learned from that that I needed to work on my communication skills to take the science, the knowledge that we have from research, and how to put that into practice. Miscommunication can reduce the impact of good science. Those people in the audience, I feel sorry for them now because they walked away probably saying, what was that about? I was talking about loading rate and impulse and all this, stuff that is so important to me, but not necessarily important or useful for the person who was training for a marathon. Sports scientists can act as translators between data and decisions. One of the key questions I get relative to running is, well, what shoe should I run in? Well, now we've got to take all the research that has been done, kinematics, kinetics, physiology, electromyography, whatever it is, and translate that information into usable points that a runner can decide which shoe he or she should select for running. And so, really, we're translating information. And key question is, how do we communicate insights to coaches and athletes and others as well when we have this knowledge base of sports science? How do we communicate that? And this graphic is just sort of a summary of what this presentation is going to be about. So, who do we communicate with? I've mentioned athletes, I've mentioned runners, coaches. Well, there's all different types of people that sports scientists will communicate: operations, athletic administrators, athletic directors, sport industry, rehab people, physical therapy, athletic training, occupational therapy, sports medicine physicians, academics, fellow scientists, and what have you. It's just sort of a graphic where you may have more contact with people in academics, maybe a dietitian, sports strength and conditioning, maybe some contact with administrators, athletic directors, what have you. So just a way to sort of emphasize the wide range of people that sports scientists will communicate with. The takeaway is, when you're dealing with all these different types of people, is you have to adapt your message for each audience. So what are some effective tools of or styles of communication? Well, one is clarity. Avoid jargon and translate metrics into performance relevance. When I talked about my marathon science seminar, and I'm talking about loading rate. Oh, that's important to me. All right, how do I convey the importance of loading rate? How fast forces are being applied to the body during running? How do I communicate that in a way that the runner will understand the importance of that, but it's not just jargon, not just biomechanics jargon. Credibility. Well, we need to support statements with data, but we need to stay concise at the same time. So it's one thing to talk about runners and the rate that they get injured, and it's another thing to provide some evidence to support those statements. And this also helps us avoid sort of falling into pitfalls of just of using anecdotes to drive our sports science decisions. We want to rely on empirical evidence. And consistency, use standardized terminology. Big thing with me and all the courses I teach is you have to define terms so that not only am I communicating the correct concept, but also the receiver understands how I'm using a term. A term that gets tossed around a lot and often is not defined is a term like fatigue. Well, what do we mean by fatigue when we're using fatigue? Do we mean mental fatigue? Do we mean physical fatigue? What are we really, how are we using that term in the context of communicating our sports science knowledge out to coaches and athletes in terms of strategies to minimize the development of fatigue or the effect of fatigue during the course of a game or what have you? Well, we need to define that term so we're all on the same page. In context, we got to explain why information matters. And so this, why information matters ultimately leads to knowledge. And so why is it important for me to understand loading rate during running or shock attenuation? Why is it important for me to understand the development of fatigue and strategies to mitigate that? So give some context of the information that we are conveying to whomever we're talking with. And tools and different formats of communication, written reports, infographics may be useful, dashboards where a coach or an athlete or another performance team member can go and look at data on a dashboard, something interactive that a person can select different metrics. And, using some type of visual storytelling can be very helpful. Graphs, highlight videos, or videos in general, athlete tracking summaries, summary videos, as I just mentioned, or other visualization tools, to help sort of make data come alive, because not everybody wants to look at a table of data or just boring slides, even like this one right here. You have verbal briefings where you have interactions between individuals and the sports scientist. Maybe it's a more official presentation that you're doing to a team, and in some context of some type of meeting. And the tool and the format that you're going to choose is really depending on the depth of information you're going into, as well as the audience, the receiver. And so here's the deal. There's a communication process works by the sender, the sports scientist, has some information, some knowledge, and encodes it in some way, verbally, written, visually, whatever it is, and sends that message to the receiver, and that receiver has to decode whatever the message is. And hopefully this is a accurate process. But a good way to make sure it is accurate is you have feedback in both directions. So you make sure the receiver is understanding the message from the sender, and vice versa. The sender is understanding what the receiver did receive. And so the pitfalls of communication, especially in sports science, is overloading with data. We can collect a lot of information as sports scientists, and it is important to identify the critical pieces of information to communicate outwards. And pitfall is using overly technical language. A lot of the receivers will not have training in sports science or in kinesiology or exercise science or whatever it is, the field that you're working in, that you're conveying information over. And so we do need to be careful not to get overly technical, or we need to explain the technical aspects in ways that the receiver can understand. A pitfall is also communicating too late to influence a decision. Runners get hurt during running. When the runner's hurt, it's too late to say, well, maybe you should have done things that way. We've got to get in front of some of the issues that coaches, athletes, performance teams need to be aware of it. And failing to check for understanding. It's, when I gave that presentation for the marathon runners, I wasn't checking in with them during the presentation. I did ask one of the group leaders afterwards about the presentation, and he sort of scratched his head and he was like, well, what should these runners have walked away with? And that was a good learning moment for me, is that I really needed to have a better understanding of what the audience wanted and what they were receiving during my presentation. So practical strategies. We'll develop a communication plan for each project. It is helpful to have a one-page summary for key findings. Sometimes we call this an executive summary. Encourage two-way communication. Present findings visually when possible. That just is an easier way to convey information, a lot of information. And really, this two-way communication is so important, because it should not just be a sports scientist lecturing to others. It should be a give and take in terms of what the receiver wants in terms of information, what we're giving in terms of information. And there needs to be a process of self-evaluation. And, just as I'm reflecting on the marathon seminar series that I did, think of a time when research and performance data weren't communicated effectively. You as an athlete, or you as a coach, or you as a practitioner, when you get information from someone, when did you say, that wasn't really useful? Well, we can turn that around, and that can be helpful to us when we are delivering the information. Identify what went wrong. How could it be improved? And how might you approach things differently as a sports scientist? So there needs to be this constant evaluation of ourselves as we're delivering information. Okay, key takeaways. Communication is as important as the data collection. The best sports science insights fail if they are not effectively and clearly shared with others. And there is this constant building trust through consistent, transparent, and effective communication. And when you do that, you have a good pathway between the information that's being collected, generating knowledge, and then giving that knowledge to coaches, athletes, practitioners, whomever it is you're communicating with, in terms of actionable items that they can use to help move things forward. Okay, thanks everybody.